The call came while everyone else in the lobby pretended not to stare. The security guard had already stepped closer to the desk. The branch manager's smile had stiffened just enough to crack, and across the polished marble floor, a man in a charcoal coat kept insisting louder each time that the woman beside him was his wife. She looked just like her, he said. Margaret Lawson stood outside the glass doors, phone pressed to her ear, listening to a voicemail that should not exist. Your husband is here with a woman who looks just like you. We need you to come in immediately. The words hit her chest like a sudden loss of air. Inside the bank smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. Outside, the wind cut through her coat, sharp and impatient. Margaret did not move. She watched through the glass as the woman at the desk leaned forward. Fingers spread rehearsed confidence in every gesture. Same height, same hair, same winter scarf. Close enough to confuse anyone who did not know the difference between a life lived and one borrowed. Margaret knew the difference. Her breath slowed. Her hand tightened around the phone until the screen went dark. 64 years on this earth had taught her one thing better than any business seminar or marriage vow ever had. When something feels wrong, you do not rush. You watch. Inside the bank, Robert Lawson was already sweating. He hated fluorescent lighting. It made him feel exposed. He kept his gloves on, even though it was warm, rubbing the leather together like friction might spark control. He told himself this would be quick. Just a signature. Just a transfer. Just a temporary solution to a permanent problem no one wanted to talk about. The woman beside him shifted her weight. Linda Parker did not like banks. She did not like places where cameras hummed softly and time moved slow. She preferred parking lots, motels, rooms with one door and no questions. But Robert had promised this was different, clean, safe, necessary. He had said it was his wife's idea. At the desk, Karen Miller, assistant branch manager, kept her voice even. She had worked this town for over 20 years. She knew which couples held hands in the grocery store and which sat apart in church. She knew Margaret Lawson's handwriting. She knew the way Margaret said, "Thank you," like it mattered. This woman did not say thank you. She said, "Please," over and over, like a performance. Karen glanced at the signature again. Close. Very close. Too close. Outside, Margaret finally pushed the door open. The sound carried. A muted chime. Soft, polite. The kind of sound that did not belong to moments like this. Karen looked up first. Her face changed before her mouth did. Relief flickered, then something like fear, then understanding. Robert turned slowly, already shaking his head, before his eyes confirmed what his body knew. Linda froze. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She walked with the careful pace of someone counting steps, each one deliberate, each one reclaiming ground. Her boots echoed. 1, 2, 3. The room seemed to shrink around her. Robert opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Margaret stopped 2 feet from the desk, close enough to see the tremor in Linda's hand, close enough to smell Robert's cologne, the one she had bought him last Christmas, when she still believed in surprises. She looked at Karen first, then the paperwork, Then the woman beside her husband. No anger yet. Just focus, I believe you called me, Margaret said. Karen nodded, swallowing. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for coming so quickly. Robert finally found his voice. Maggie, listen. This isn't what it looks like. Margaret turned to him, slowly. Her eyes did not soften. They assessed, measured, catalogued. She had learned that look years ago, sitting across from men who underestimated her, because she smiled easily and spoke gently. What it looks like, Robert, she said, is you standing in my bank with a stranger holding my name. Linda flinched at the word stranger. Robert laughed, too sharp, too fast. That's not fair. Linda's helping us. You know that. We talked about this. Margaret's gaze snapped to Linda. Did we? Linda swallowed. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted to Robert, then to the cameras, then back to Margaret. She had practiced answers. She had not practiced this woman. Margaret stepped closer. Not threatening. Intimate. She studied Linda's face like a mirror with the silver rubbed thin. What's my middle name? Margaret asked softly. Linda blinked. I'm sorry. My middle name? Margaret repeated. You should know it. If you are me. Silence thickened. The hum of the lights grew louder. Somewhere, a printer whirred. Robert snapped. Enough. This is ridiculous. Margaret did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Linda. What street did I grow up on? Linda's lips parted. No sound came out. Margaret exhaled slowly. She turned back to Karen. Please lock my accounts. Robert slammed his hand on the desk. You can't do that. I'm her husband. Karen's voice shook but held. Sir, I can and I am. The security guard stepped closer. Margaret felt the first crack then. Not in the room, in herself. A small one. Sharp. The sound of something breaking that had already been hollow. She remembered the night Robert sat at the kitchen table, staring at his pills like they were an insult. The bills she had started paying without comment. The way he flinched when she took calls in the other room. She had thought it was pride. She had been wrong. Robert leaned toward her, lowering his voice. Maggie, you don't understand. We're running out of time. Margaret finally met his eyes. For the first time, something cold moved behind hers. I understand exactly how much time we have left, she said. And this is not how you buy more. Linda whispered. Robert, you said this would work. Margaret turned to her. He always does until it doesn't. Karen was already dialing. Corporate compliance. Local authorities. Protocols that existed for days like this, even if no one wanted to believe they would ever need them. Robert backed away, hands up. This is being blown out of proportion. Margaret took one step forward. Her voice dropped. Controlled. Final. You walked into a bank with a woman who looks like me because you thought no one would look closely. You thought age made us invisible. You thought I was just someone's wife. Robert stared at her, finally seeing something he had missed for years. Margaret straightened. For a moment, The room felt smaller than it had any right to be. She was no longer the woman people waved at from their cars or nodded to in the church aisle. She was something else. Someone else. And this was only the beginning. Because the real story was not about a look-alike. It was about what men do when they are afraid, and what happens when they forget who they married. The police did not arrive with sirens. They never do not for people like Margaret Lawson. They came quiet, almost apologetic coats, buttoned hands resting near their belts, like they hoped this would resolve itself without paperwork. 2 officers. One older one, young enough to still look surprised by what money makes people do. Margaret watched them through the glass of the private consultation room as Karen closed the door behind them. The sound was soft. Final. Robert sat across from her shoulders, hunched now, gloves finally off. His hands shook. Not violently, just enough to notice. The way they had the night he admitted the doctor had used the word progressive. The way fear shows up when pride is exhausted. Linda sat to his left knees, pressed together, purse clutched to her chest like it contained instructions. She had stopped pretending to be calm. Her breathing was shallow, eyes fixed on the carpet, as if it might open and swallow her. Margaret rested her palms on the table. Flat, steady. The wood was cool beneath her skin. Officer Daniels cleared his throat. "Mrs. Lawson, we're here to ask a few questions." Margaret nodded. "Of course," Robert jumped in. "This is all a misunderstanding." Officer Daniels glanced at the paperwork. "Sir, we'll decide that." The younger officer shifted his weight. "Ma'am, did you authorize your husband to initiate a withdrawal from your accounts today?" Margaret did not hesitate. "No." "Did you authorize anyone to act on your behalf?" "No." Robert's jaw tightened. "Maggie, you told me." Margaret cut him off without raising her voice. "I told you we would talk. I did not tell you to bring a stranger into my bank." Linda flinched at the word again. Officer Daniels looked at Linda. "Ma'am, can you explain why you were presenting yourself as Margaret Lawson?" Linda swallowed. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. That wasn't the question." She glanced at Robert. He stared straight ahead. Linda's voice cracked. "He said it was temporary, just until things got sorted. He said his wife agreed." Margaret studied her then. Really studied her. The way Linda's coat was slightly too nice for her shoes. The way her nails were clean but bitten. The nervous habit of rubbing her thumb against the zipper pull. "How much did he offer you?" Margaret asked quietly. Linda hesitated. Officer Daniels nodded. "You can answer," Linda whispered. 20,000. Margaret closed her eyes for half a second. $20,000 to borrow a life she had spent decades building. Robert finally turned to her. It wasn't like that. Margaret opened her eyes. It was exactly like that. Officer Daniels sighed. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to stand up." Robert looked up sharply. "For what?" "For attempted fraud," Officer Daniels said, "and for impersonation involving financial institutions." "Please don't make this harder than it already is." Robert laughed, a thin sound. "You're arresting me." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. Not guilt, not regret, recognition. "You're making a mistake," Robert said, standing slowly. "I'm her husband." "You were," Margaret said. "Right up until you decided my name was something you could borrow." The cuffs clicked. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Linda began to cry, quietly at first, then harder, like the dam had been holding back longer than just today. Officer Daniels turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Lawson, we'll need you to come down to the station later to give a formal statement." Margaret nodded. "I understand." Karen opened the door. Her eyes were red. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Margaret touched her arm. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." Robert was escorted out first. He did not look back. Linda hesitated in the doorway. She turned to Margaret, eyes wet. "I didn't know he'd go this far." Margaret's voice was calm. "You knew far enough." The door closed. Silence settled in like dust. Margaret remained seated. Her knees felt weak now that the room no longer required strength. Karen offered her water. She took it, hands trembling despite herself. This wasn't how she had imagined losing a husband. She had expected illness, distance, quiet grief, not police reports and borrowed faces. Her phone buzzed. Elaine Carter. Margaret stared at the name. Her sister. Younger by 5 years. The one who had warned her. She answered. "It happened," Margaret said, before Elaine could speak. Elaine exhaled sharply. "I'm on my way." There was a knock. The branch manager stepped in, holding a file. "Mrs. Lawson, there's something else." Margaret looked up. Her eyes were tired now. "Yes." The manager hesitated. "We reviewed your account history. There were several small transfers over the past year, always just under reporting thresholds. We assumed they were routine household expenses." Margaret's breath caught. "Robert." The manager nodded. "They total nearly $80,000. The room tilted slightly. Margaret closed her eyes again. Not because she was overwhelmed, because she was adding things up. She had wondered. The missing cash, the vague explanations, the way Robert flinched when she asked for receipts. "I want copies of everything," Margaret said. "Of course." Elaine arrived 30 minutes later, coat half buttoned, hair wind-blown. She wrapped Margaret in a hug without asking. Margaret did not cry. She leaned into it anyway. "I told you," Elaine murmured. Margaret nodded. "I know." They sat in the parking lot for a long moment, engines off. Snow drifted lightly, settling on windshields like a pause. "I don't understand," Elaine said finally. "Why now?" Margaret stared straight ahead. Because he was running out of time. That night, Margaret sat alone in the house she had shared with Robert for 11 years. She walked through the rooms, slowly. The living room where he watched the news and complained about politics, the kitchen where he avoided the scale, the bedroom where he stopped touching her months ago. She opened his desk drawer, found the second phone immediately. No lock. He had never been subtle. The messages were there, a name she did not recognize. Mark. Advice, pressure, plans. You're entitled to more. She closed the drawer. At 11:15 in the evening, her phone rang again. Unknown number. Margaret answered. "Hello." "Mrs. Lawson," a man said. "This is Detective Harris. I'm calling regarding your husband." Her grip tightened. "Yes. We searched his vehicle. We found a folder. Insurance policies." Yours. Margaret's stomach dropped. How much coverage? $5 million, detective said. You as the insured. Your husband as beneficiary. Silence stretched. Detective Harris continued. There were also searches on his phone. Accidents, falls, home break-ins. Margaret's heart began to pound, slow and heavy. Mrs. Lawson, the detective said gently, I don't think today was the end of this. Margaret stared at the dark window. Her reflection looked older, sharper. I'll cooperate fully, she said. I know you will. The call ended. Margaret sat there a long time after. The house creaked. The heat clicked on. Somewhere, a clock ticked patient and unforgiving. She had thought betrayal was about money. She was wrong. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the tracks leading up to the house, erasing evidence, pretending nothing had happened. Margaret stood, went to the study, and opened the safe Robert had never known about. Inside were documents, trust papers, old contracts, contingency plans she had drawn up years ago and prayed she would never need. She took them out, one by one, laying them on the desk like weapons. Some people think age makes you fragile. They forget what it also brings. Memory, instinct, and the understanding that when the truth finally shows itself, you do not flinch. You prepare. Morning did not soften anything. The snow had stopped, but the cold lingered sharp and deliberate, the kind that seeps into bones and stays there. Margaret Lawson stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the pale light crawling over the neighborhood. Someone across the street was scraping ice from a windshield. The sound was steady, normal, almost cruel in its normalcy. Her coffee sat untouched. At 7:30 in the morning, the doorbell rang. Margaret did not jump. She already knew who it would be. Fear announces itself loudly. What stood on her porch now was something else. She opened the door to find Detective Harris and a woman she did not recognize. The woman was in her early 50s, hair pulled back, tight eyes alert in the way that came from years of watching people lie. Mrs. Lawson, Harris said. This is Special Agent Ruth Calder with the State Financial Crimes Unit. Margaret stepped aside. Come in. They did not remove their coats. Ruth glanced around the living room, taking in the framed photos, the antique sideboard, the absence of anything flashy. She clocked it all in seconds. We didn't want to wait, Ruth said. Not after what we found overnight. Margaret folded her hands together. Tell me. They sat at the dining table. The chair Robert used remained empty. Ruth opened a folder. Your husband's phone records go back further than we expected. The transfers from your joint accounts weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern. Margaret nodded once. I assumed as much. Ruth's eyebrow lifted slightly. You assumed. I noticed discrepancies months ago. Small enough to ignore if you wanted to. I didn't want to. Harris leaned forward. Why didn't you act sooner? Margaret met his eyes. Because when you've been married long enough, you learn the difference between suspicion and certainty. I was waiting for certainty. Ruth flipped a page. He wasn't acting alone. Margaret's jaw tightened. Who was he working with? A man named Charles Whitman. 61, former financial advisor, lost his license a decade ago. Now operates as a private consultant. He specializes in what we call elder leverage schemes. Margaret did not blink. He identifies aging spouses with health concerns, convinces them their families are better off without knowing the details, then drains assets quietly. Ruth studied her. "You're familiar with the term?" Margaret's voice was flat. "I sit on the board of a non-profit that funds legal aid for seniors. We see cases like this more often than people want to admit." Harris exhaled. "That explains some things," Ruth continued. "Whitman didn't just suggest the impersonation, he arranged it. Linda Parker wasn't hired by your husband directly. She was recruited through Whitman's network." Margaret's fingers curled slightly. "Where is Whitman now?" "We don't know. But we do know this wasn't meant to stop with a bank transfer." Harris slid another document across the table. A timeline. The dates were familiar. Too familiar. "Your husband increased your life insurance coverage 6 months ago," Ruth said. "He also updated your emergency contacts, removed your sister, added himself as sole decision-maker." Margaret felt the weight of it then. Not panic. Understanding. "He was isolating me." Ruth nodded. "That's standard. Reduce noise, control information." Margaret pushed back her chair and stood. She walked to the window, pressing her palm against the glass. The street was quiet now. Children waiting for a bus, a dog pulling its owner along the sidewalk. "I want full access to the investigation," Margaret said. "As a courtesy. As a participant." Harris hesitated. "Mrs. Lawson, I am not asking. I am offering resources, legal, financial, testimonial, whatever you need." Ruth and Harris exchanged a look. "You're not just a victim," Ruth said carefully. Margaret turned back to them. "No, I'm a liability. To them." Ruth closed the folder. "In that case, we need to talk about your assets." Margaret smiled faintly. "We already are." Later that afternoon, Margaret sat in a conference room 2 floors above a downtown law office that did not advertise its presence. The windows were tinted. The chairs were uncomfortable on purpose. Across from her sat 3 people. Her attorney, James Holloway, a forensic accountant named Peter Ross, and Ruth Calder, who had returned without her badge visible. James cleared his throat. "Margaret, we need to understand the full scope of what you control." Margaret rested her hands on the table. "Very well." She spoke calmly. "About the trust established before her second marriage. About the properties held under a holding company, no one associated with her name. About the board positions she maintained quietly. About the emergency clauses activated only under threat." Peter stopped taking notes halfway through. He looked up, eyes wide. "Why wasn't this disclosed earlier?" "Because I never needed it to be," Margaret said. "Until now." James leaned back slowly. Robert had no idea. "No. He thought I was careful. He never imagined I was prepared." Ruth studied Margaret with something close to respect. "You understand that once this moves forward, it won't stay quiet." Margaret nodded. "Good." By evening, the town already knew Robert Lawson had been arrested. People whispered at the grocery store. Phones rang. Margaret ignored them. Instead, she drove to the community centre. The building was old, brick, familiar. The same place Linda Parker volunteered twice a week, serving soup to seniors who pretended they weren't struggling. Margaret found Linda sitting alone in a side room, hands wrapped around a paper cup. Linda looked up, startled. "You're not supposed to be here." Margaret closed the door behind her. "Neither are you." Linda's shoulders slumped. "I didn't know how bad it was going to get." Margaret pulled out a chair and sat. "You knew enough?" Linda's eyes filled. "He said you were sick. He said you didn't want people to know." Margaret inhaled slowly. He always chose lies that sounded like concern. Linda stared at her hands. "I didn't know about the insurance." Margaret believed her. That was the most dangerous part. "Tell me about Whitman," Margaret said. Linda shook her head. "He doesn't use that name. Describe him. Late 50s, grey hair, always smiling. Makes you feel like you're smarter than everyone else in the room." Margaret nodded. "Where does he meet people? Community events, financial seminars, church breakfasts, anywhere trust walks in without looking over its shoulder." Margaret stood. "Thank you." Linda looked up. "Are they going to put me in prison?" Margaret paused at the door. "That depends on whether you decide to tell the truth." That night, Margaret returned home to find Elaine waiting. They sat in silence for a long time. "You were right," Margaret said finally. Elaine shook her head. "I didn't want to be." Margaret looked around the room. This house, this life, all of it had been slowly turned against her. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed, a message from Ruth. "We located Whitman's shell accounts. He's moving money." Margaret typed back. "Let him." Elaine frowned. "What does that mean?" Margaret set the phone down. "It means he thinks he's winning." Elaine studied her sister. "Who are you right now?" Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm the woman they underestimated." Upstairs, the study light flicked on. Margaret unlocked the cabinet behind the bookshelf. Inside were files no one had seen in years. Names, dates, patterns. This wasn't just about Robert, or Linda, or Whitman. This was about a system that fed on silence. Margaret sat at the desk and began making calls. Not to the police, to people who listened when she spoke. By midnight, the board that. And somewhere Charles Whitman was about to learn what happened when the wrong woman stopped being polite and started paying attention. Charles Whitman hated hospitals. The smell, the lighting, the way time stretched in places where people waited for news they did not want. He sat in the passenger seat of a grey sedan parked 2 blocks from a private clinic outside Harrisburg, watching the entrance through dark lenses. His phone vibrated once, then again. Updates, numbers moving, accounts shifting, exactly as planned. He smiled. Inside the clinic, Robert Lawson lay propped against white pillows, color drained from his face monitors, ticking out a rhythm that sounded too loud in the small room. The procedure had gone well, the doctor said. Recovery would take time. Rest, monitoring, dependence. Robert nodded, too tired to argue. His chest hurt. His thoughts felt slow. He hated that more than the pain. When the nurse left, Robert reached for his phone. No service. He frowned. Tried again. Nothing. He did not know that an hour earlier, Detective Harris had walked into the nurse's station with a badge and a quiet authority that did not invite questions. He did not know that Ruth Calder had stood behind him, arms crossed, watching as permissions were updated and contact lists were corrected. He did not know Margaret Lawson had signed the forms herself. At the same time, Margaret sat in a modest conference room at the community center, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle. The sign on the door read, "Financial Safety Workshop. Coffee and cookies available. Seniors welcome." People came because Margaret asked. Neighbors, church friends, retirees who trusted her because she had always been there, steady and unassuming. They sat murmuring, coats draped over chairs, hands wrapped around paper cups. Margaret stood at the front, not behind a podium. She waited until the room settled. "I want to talk about something uncomfortable," she began. "About money, about trust, about how easy it is to confuse the two." She did not mention Robert, not yet. She talked about scams, about gentle voices on the phone, about promises made in small rooms with big consequences. She watched faces change, recognition flicker, shame soften into relief. "You are not foolish," she said. "You are targeted." A hand went up. A man in his 70s. "My neighbor lost everything he said. He never told anyone." Margaret nodded. "That's how they win." At the back of the room, a woman recorded quietly on her phone. Margaret noticed. She did not stop her. Across town, Whitman finally stepped out of the car, annoyed. He checked his phone again. The transfer should have cleared. It had not. He called his associate. No answer. He frowned, irritation creeping in. He had built his life on leverage, on knowing who needed what and when. He did not like variables he had not accounted for. His phone rang. Unknown number. Whitman answered. "Yes." "Mrs. Lawson sends her regards," Ruth Calder said. Whitman's smile did not falter. "I don't know who that is." "You do," Ruth said. "And you know why I'm calling." Whitman leaned against the car, lowering his voice. "If this is about Robert, he made his own choices." Ruth's tone hardened. "We've connected 6 similar cases to you. Different towns. Same pattern, same timing, same shell companies." Whitman laughed softly. "You'll never make it stick." Ruth paused. "Maybe not, but we don't need to." The line went dead. Whitman stared at the phone, unease creeping in. That evening, Margaret sat at her dining table, papers spread out like a map. James Holloway stood nearby, reading silently. Elaine hovered in the kitchen doorway. "The workshop worked," Elaine said. "People are talking." Margaret nodded. "That was the point." James looked up. "We received 3 calls, similar stories, different names, same consultant." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "How many more?" James hesitated. "Enough." Margaret straightened. "Then we don't stop." Her phone buzzed. A message from Ruth. "We froze Whitman's primary accounts." "He's scrambling," Margaret typed back. "Good. Let him move." Elaine frowned. "Isn't that risky?" Margaret shook her head. It's instructive. Later that night, Whitman sat at his desk, surrounded by screens. Numbers blurred, accounts locked, calls unanswered. His confidence began to crack. He searched for Margaret Lawson. News articles, community bulletins. A video clip from the workshop appeared. Margaret's face calm, composed, speaking about protection and awareness. He scoffed. A charity case. Then his phone rang again, this time a different number. Whitman answered sharply. What? Mr. Whitman, a woman said. My name is Sarah Cole. I'm with the State Attorney General's office. We'd like to speak with you about your consulting practices. Whitman's pulse quickened. I'm busy. So are we, Sarah replied. Which is why we'll come to you. The call ended. Whitman sat back, breathing hard. He had been careful, always careful. He had survived worse. He did not see the second wave coming. The next morning, Margaret sat across from a local reporter in a quiet cafe. She had agreed to the interview on one condition. No names withheld. No anonymous sources. This isn't about revenge, Margaret said. It's about visibility. The reporter nodded. You're saying this is systemic. I'm saying silence is profitable for the wrong people. By noon, the story was live. Not sensational. Measured. Credible. The kind that spread because it felt true. By afternoon, Whitman's name trended locally. Former clients came forward. Regulators took notice. At the clinic, Robert watched the news from his bed, confusion giving way to dread. He asked for Margaret. The nurse shook her head gently. She's not on your list. Robert's chest tightened. He reached for his phone again. Still no service. He whispered her name, but it sounded small in the room. That night, Margaret stood alone in her study, looking at the city lights beyond the window. She felt tired. Not weak. Earned. Ruth called. We have a warrant. Margaret closed her eyes. For Whitman. Yes. And Robert. Margaret exhaled slowly. Do it. When the call ended, Elaine stepped in. Are you okay? Margaret nodded. I am. She thought of the workshop, the faces, the relief, the anger turning into resolve. She thought of Robert, the man she had loved now revealed as something smaller than she had believed. Not a monster. A warning. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, then faded. Margaret turned off the light. Some stories end with forgiveness, some with punishment. This one was ending with something quieter and far more dangerous. Awareness. And it was spreading. The arrest happened before dawn. Charles Whitman was still in his robe when the knock came sharp and precise, the kind that did not ask permission. He opened the door with practiced irritation and found 3 agents standing in the narrow hallway. Badges out, faces unreadable. The lead agent spoke his name like it had weight. Charles Whitman. You are being detained in connection with multiple counts of financial exploitation, conspiracy, and fraud targeting elderly individuals. Whitman did not argue. He smiled, thin and brittle. This is unnecessary. The agent stepped forward. It's overdue. Across town, Margaret Lawson woke to the sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. She did not rush to answer. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet house, the old floors settling, the heat clicking on. Then she picked up. Ruth's voice was low, controlled. "He's in custody." Margaret closed her eyes. "Thank you." There was a pause. Ruth added, "Robert has been formally charged as well. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, attempted fraud conspiracy." The insurance angle escalated everything. Margaret exhaled slowly. He made his choices. "We'll need you later today," Ruth said. "Statement. Possibly testimony." Margaret sat up. "I'll be there." By mid-morning, the town had shifted. Conversations hushed when Margaret entered the grocery store. Some people smiled at her with sympathy. Others looked away, embarrassed on her behalf. She felt none of it settle. What she felt instead was distance. The sense of stepping out of a story she no longer belonged to. Elaine met her at the courthouse steps. "You ready?" Margaret nodded. "As I'll ever be." Inside, the air smelled of old paper and disinfectant. Robert sat at the defense table, thinner than she remembered, eyes rimmed red. He looked up when she entered. Hope flared, then died. Margaret did not sit near him. She took her place beside Ruth and James. Posture straight, hands folded. When she testified, her voice did not waver. She spoke of timelines, of missing funds, of conversations that had once sounded harmless and now rang with warning. When asked how she felt, she answered honestly. Betrayed. Angry. Grateful it ended before something worse happened. Robert stared at the table. He did not look at her again. Outside, reporters waited. Margaret ignored the questions and walked past Elaine's hand, steady at her elbow. The sun felt too bright. She squinted, breathed, kept moving. That afternoon, Margaret returned to the community center. The chairs were arranged again, fuller this time. New faces. Familiar ones, too. People who had heard her name and come not for gossip, but for understanding. She did not speak from notes. She spoke from memory. "I didn't think this could happen to me," she said. "That was my mistake. Not trusting. Assuming trust protected me." A woman raised her hand, voice trembling. "My husband handles everything. I don't even know our account numbers." Margaret nodded gently. "Then that's where you start." A man in the back said, "They make you feel stupid for asking questions." "They count on that," Margaret replied. The room leaned in. Stories spilled out. Near misses. Quiet losses. Shame turned into shared anger, then resolve. Margaret listened more than she spoke. That mattered. When the meeting ended, Ruth waited near the door. "You started something," Ruth said. Margaret shook her head. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't there." 2 weeks later, the state announced a formal task force on elder financial exploitation. Margaret was named as an advisory member. She accepted without ceremony. Robert's attorney called once. Margaret declined the call. Then the letters started. Apologies, explanations, justifications. She read none of them. Linda Parker took a plea deal. She testified. She cried. She named names. Margaret did not attend that hearing. She had said all she needed to say. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Margaret sat alone in her study, sunlight slanting across the desk. She opened a small box she had not touched in years. Inside were photographs. Her first husband, their younger selves, the life she had rebuilt piece by piece after loss. She realized something then. This was not the second time she had survived the end of a marriage. It was the second time she had chosen herself. The phone rang. Margaret answered. "Hello. Mrs. Lawson," a woman said. "My name is Teresa Green. I live in Altoona. I saw you speak last week. I think what happened to you is happening to my mother." Margaret's grip tightened. "Tell me everything." They spoke for an hour. Then another call came. Then another. Patterns emerged. Familiar now. Predictable. Breakable. That evening, Margaret walked through her house, touching the walls, lightly grounding herself. She packed a box. Robert's things. Photos. Shoes. A life that no longer fit. She placed the box by the door. At 9:30, Elaine arrived with takeout and 2 forks. "You hungry?" Margaret smiled faintly. Starving. They ate in companionable silence. Outside, the town settled into night. Somewhere, a television murmured. Somewhere else, a phone rang unanswered. Elaine broke the silence. "You ever think about forgiving him?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think about releasing myself from carrying it." "That's not the same thing." "No." The next morning, Margaret stood at the window as movers carried the box out. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Final but not cruel. She sat at the desk and opened her calendar. Appointments filled the weeks ahead. Meetings, workshops, court dates, conversations that mattered. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ruth. "Whitman is cooperating. Names, accounts. It's bigger than we thought," Margaret typed back. "It usually is." She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. Exhaustion washed over her deep and earned. But beneath it, something steadier held. Purpose. Some people would remember this as the story of a woman betrayed by her husband and a look-alike in a bank. Margaret knew better. This was the story of what happens when silence breaks. And she was not done speaking yet. The hearing room was colder than it needed to be. Margaret Lawson sat at the long table beneath fluorescent lights that flattened everything they touched. Faces across from her, blurred into a line of suits and notepads. Voices clipped careful. This was not a courtroom. It was where decisions were shaped before they became law, where language mattered more than volume. She adjusted her glasses and waited. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Mrs. Lawson, thank you for agreeing to testify before the committee." Margaret nodded. "I didn't agree out of courtesy. I agreed because this keeps happening." A murmur rippled through the room. The chairwoman gestured. "You may proceed." Margaret did not begin with her husband. She did not begin with the bank. She began with a number spoken slowly, deliberately. Last year, she said Americans over the age of 60 lost over $3 billion to financial exploitation. Pens paused. Heads lifted. She continued. Most of those cases were never reported, not because the victims didn't know they'd been harmed, but because they were ashamed. Because the harm came from people they trusted. A man in the second row shifted uncomfortably. Margaret folded her hands. "I am here because I had resources, Legal counsel, community standing. Many do not. She described patterns, how small withdrawals stayed under thresholds, how caregivers and spouses positioned themselves as protectors, how consultants used language that sounded responsible and patient. She spoke calmly, but each word landed with weight. When she finished, the room was silent. A senator leaned forward. "Mrs. Lawson, are you suggesting that existing safeguards are insufficient?" Margaret met his gaze. "I am saying they were designed for strangers, not for the people who share your bed." Ruth Calder sat against the back wall, arms crossed, watching the room recalibrate. This was not a plea. It was an indictment. After the hearing, Margaret stepped into the corridor. Reporters waited. Cameras hummed. She did not stop. Ruth caught up with her near the elevators. "You just made enemies." Margaret smiled faintly. "I already had them." By afternoon, headlines shifted. Not sensational. Substantive. Elder exploitation framed as a structural failure, not personal embarrassment. Policy analysts weighed in. Banks quietly adjusted internal memos. Margaret returned home late, the house quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. She set her bag down and stood still, letting the silence settle. Then the phone rang. Unknown number. Margaret answered. "Hello." "Mrs. Lawson," a man said. "This is Thomas Reed." She knew the name. Everyone did. He did not waste time. "I understand you sit on the board of Sentinel Trust." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." Sentinel Trust managed pensions across 6 states. Quiet, conservative, untouchable. Reed continued. "We've identified irregularities linked to Charles Whitman that passed through our secondary systems years ago. We need to know how far back your knowledge goes." Margaret's voice was steady. "Further than you'd like." There was a pause. He said carefully, "We would like to consult with you." Margaret replied, "I don't consult. I decide." Another pause. Longer. The next morning, Margaret walked into the Sentinel Trust building using a side entrance she had not used in years. The security guard nodded, startled. She returned the nod and kept moving. The boardroom overlooked the river. Men and women around the table rose when she entered, some belatedly. Margaret did not sit at the end. She took the central seat. "I assume you've all read the brief," she said. No one spoke. Margaret continued. "For years we told ourselves that fiduciary duty ended at paperwork, that if the forms were clean, the outcome was not our responsibility. That stops today." A board member cleared his throat. "With respect, Margaret implementing to these changes would affect margins." Margaret turned to him. "So does prison." The room went still. She outlined reforms. Mandatory dual verification, even for spouses. Behavioral audits. Community education funded not as charity, but as infrastructure. Whistleblower protections that extended to clients. By the time she finished, there was no argument left to make. Outside rain began to fall, streaking the windows like a warning. That evening, Ruth called. "Whitman is talking." Margaret set the phone down on speaker. "Good." He named names, consultants, bank officers, A pilot who moved cash, a caregiver who acted as courier, a network that fed on invisibility. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Ruth finished, she asked, "What do you want next?" Margaret thought of the hearing, the boardroom, the quiet faces in the community center. "I want restitution funds established," she said. "Mandatory, automatic. I want training tied to licensing. I want banks fined for silence, not just theft." Ruth exhaled. "That's ambitious." Margaret's tone hardened. So was what they did. The next weeks blurred. Meetings, calls, documents. Margaret slept little. She ate when reminded. Elaine watched from the edges, worried but proud. One night, as Margaret sorted through files, she found an old letter from her first husband. He had written it before surgery, in case he didn't wake. "You have a way of seeing what matters," it read. "Don't ever doubt that." Her phone buzzed again. "Mrs. Lawson," a woman said. "This is the governor's office." Margaret closed her eyes. "Yes. We're forming a task council on elder financial protection. We'd like you to chair it." Margaret did not hesitate. "I accept." The announcement landed quietly but firmly. States followed. Federal agencies adjusted language. Training modules changed. Banks complied. And somewhere in a holding cell, Charles Whitman watched the news recognition dawning too late. Margaret returned to the community center on a cold evening. The chairs filled once more. She did not stand at the front this time. She sat among them. An older man leaned over. "You did all this." Margaret shook her head. "We did." She looked around the room. Faces lined with time, eyes sharp with understanding. This was not about her anymore. Later, alone in her study, Margaret poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The city lights reflected back, steady, enduring. Somewhere, a system had shifted, and it would not shift back. The verdict came on a Tuesday, the kind of day no one remembers until it changes something forever. Margaret Lawson sat in the second row of the courtroom, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the seal behind the judge's bench. She did not look at Robert when the jury filed back in. She had learned the cost of looking backward. The foreperson stood, voice trembling just slightly. "On all counts we find the defendant guilty." A sound moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet release of air from a people who had been holding their breath for far too long. Robert's shoulders sagged. His attorney leaned in, whispering something urgent, but it no longer mattered. The shape of his future had just hardened. Margaret felt nothing at first. No triumph, no grief, just confirmation, the kind that settles deep like a final stitch. The judge spoke about breach of trust, about exploitation, about the particular cruelty of crimes committed inside a marriage. The sentence was read. Years. Not symbolic. Real. Robert finally turned toward her. Their eyes met for the first time in months. His were wet, searching. Hers were steady, unreadable. Margaret stood when it was over. She did not wait for the deputies to lead him away. She did not need closure from a man who had tried to turn her life into a transaction. Outside, the courthouse steps were slick with recent rain. Reporters clustered microphones raised. Margaret paused. Just once. This wasn't about punishment, she said. It was about stopping something that thrives in silence. Then she walked away. That night, Margaret returned home alone. Elaine had offered to stay. Margaret declined. She wanted the quiet. She poured a glass of water, stood at the kitchen counter, and finally let herself feel the weight of it. The marriage, the betrayal, the narrowness of how close she had come to losing everything without knowing why. She sat at the table and cried. Not loudly. Not long. The kind of crying that comes when you realize you are safe now. The phone rang as she wiped her face. "Mrs. Lawson," a man said. "This is Daniel Price with the National Banking Oversight Council." Margaret straightened. "Yes, we've reviewed the reforms you proposed. The pilot programs are exceeding expectations." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Good. There's something else. We'd like you to lead a federal advisory panel. Temporary appointment. 6 months. Margaret smiled faintly. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent. We're hoping it does. The next weeks carried her forward, whether she was ready or not. Travel. Briefings. Rooms filled with people who had never thought to listen before. Margaret spoke plainly. She did not soften her language. She did not apologize for her authority. One afternoon, she found herself standing in front of a room full of bank executives half her age. She saw the skepticism in their eyes, the calculation. She told them about a woman named Teresa Green, about a mother who almost lost her house because she trusted the wrong voice, about a husband who thought paperwork mattered more than consequence. "You think this is about policy," Margaret said. "It's about power, and who you let hold it." By the time she finished, no one was checking their phone. At home, the town adjusted to her new reality. Some treated her like a symbol, others like a warning. Margaret remained neither. She still shopped at the same grocery store, still attended church, still volunteered on Thursdays. But now people stopped her quietly, thanked her, asked questions, shared things they had never said out loud. One evening as she walked to her car, a young man approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Lawson, my grandmother watches your talks online." Margaret smiled. "Does she?" He nodded. "She made me sit down and listen." He paused. "Thank you." Margaret drove home slowly that night, the road familiar, the sky heavy with stars. She thought of her grandchildren, of what they would inherit. Not just money, knowledge. The letter came 3 months later. Margaret stared at the envelope before opening it. The handwriting was shaky. Careful. She did not need to read the name to know who it was from. She opened it anyway. "Maggie," it began. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I need you to know I understand now what I tried to take from you. Not the money. The choice." Margaret folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She did not burn it. She did not respond. Understanding did not require reconciliation. That weekend, Margaret hosted a small dinner. Elaine, Ruth, James, a few community leaders who had stood quietly behind her from the beginning. They ate well, laughed more than Margaret expected. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for months finally eased. Ruth raised her glass. To Margaret Lawson, who reminded us that systems don't fix themselves. Margaret lifted her glass. To all of you, who didn't look away. Later, after the dishes were done and the house returned to silence, Margaret stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, clean. She breathed deeply. Her phone buzzed. Mrs. Lawson, a woman said, when Margaret answered. My name is Helen Price. I live in Oregon. I think my husband has been talking to someone like Whitman. Margaret closed her eyes. All right, Helen. Let's start from the beginning. She went inside, pulled out a notebook, and sat at the table. Some stories end when the verdict is read. This one was only changing shape. Margaret wrote Helen's name at the top of the page, steady hand, clear ink. She had learned something important through all of this. Justice was not a moment. It was a practice, and she intended to keep it. The call came just after midnight. Margaret Lawson was awake, sitting at her desk with a lamp turned low, rereading a deposition she already knew by heart. The house was quiet in the way it only gets after you've lived alone long enough to recognize every sound it makes. When the phone vibrated, she didn't flinch. She answered on the second ring. Mrs. Lawson, a man said. This is Agent Samuel Ortiz with Federal Protective Services. Margaret straightened. Yes. We intercepted a communication tonight. A credible one. Someone has been asking questions about you, your routines, your schedule, your address. Margaret felt the air shift in the room, asking how. Ortiz paused. Not admiration. Silence stretched. Margaret looked at the window, the dark glass reflecting her own face back at her. Calm, alert. Is this connected to Whitman? She asked. Indirectly. The network is fractured but not gone. When systems collapse, people get desperate. Margaret nodded once. What do you need from me? For now, awareness. We're assigning a detail. Discreet. Margaret exhaled slowly. Do it. When the call ended, she sat still, hands resting on the desk. This was the part no one talked about. The moment after victory, when the cost finally showed its face. At 8 the next morning, a black sedan idled across the street. The driver nodded when Margaret stepped outside. No introductions, no drama, just presence. Elaine arrived an hour later, worry written plainly on her face. Someone's watching you now, Elaine said. Margaret poured coffee. Someone always was. We just didn't know it before. That afternoon, Margaret drove to the Federal Building downtown for a closed session. The room was windowless, the kind designed to keep secrets in. Around the table sat people who did not smile easily. Prosecutors, analysts, a woman from Homeland Security who spoke in acronyms. They briefed her carefully. There were still accounts moving, smaller, sloppier. People trying to salvage what they could before the doors closed completely. One name surfaced again and again. A man Margaret did not recognize. Who is he? Margaret asked. A courier, the analyst said. Cash, documents, messages. He knows where the bodies are buried. Margaret leaned forward. Then he's afraid. Yes. Margaret's voice was steady. Fear makes people predictable. The woman from Homeland Security studied her. "You're comfortable with this language." Margaret met her gaze. "I'm comfortable with reality." When the meeting ended, Ruth walked with her to the elevator. "You okay?" Ruth asked. Margaret considered the question. "I'm adjusting." Ruth nodded. "That's honest." On the drive home, Margaret took the long way, passing through neighborhoods she hadn't visited in years. Old brick houses, faded porches, places where people trusted the wrong voices because they wanted to believe in something stable. Her phone rang. "Mrs. Lawson," a woman said softly. "This is Helen Price again. I don't think I'm safe." Margaret pulled over. "Tell me what happened." Helen spoke quickly now. "He found the paperwork. He said I was paranoid." He grabbed my arm. "He's never done that before." Margaret's chest tightened. "Are you alone?" "Yes." "Where is he?" "At work, I think." Margaret did not hesitate. "I want you to call your sister, right now. Pack a bag, leave the house." Helen's voice shook. "I don't want to make things worse." Margaret's tone sharpened. "This is how worse starts. You go now." When Helen hung up, Margaret dialed another number. Ruth answered immediately. "I need a welfare check in Oregon," Margaret said. "Domestic element. Financial coercion." Ruth exhaled. "I'll handle it." That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the weight of it pressing in. She had pulled threads. The fabric was tearing. And tearing made noise. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She answered. "Yes." "Mrs. Lawson," a voice said. Familiar. Too smooth. "You don't know me, but I know you." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I doubt that." The man chuckled. "You think you ended something?" "You didn't. You humiliated people. That has consequences." Margaret's voice did not rise. "Threats won't bring your system back." The line went quiet for a beat. Then, "You should have stayed quiet." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Silence is what you depended on." The call disconnected. Margaret stared at the phone, then set it down carefully. She did not call Ruth, not yet. First, she wrote down the number. Time. Tone. Words. She had learned that documentation was its own form of armor. The next morning, headlines shifted again. Not about her, about the task force, about new arrests, about banks named publicly. Margaret watched from a distance. At noon, she met with her security detail. Procedures, adjustments, boundaries. She listened, asked questions, took notes. "I don't want to live behind walls," Margaret said. The lead agent nodded. "You won't. We'll walk with you instead." That evening, Margaret attended a town hall she had agreed to months earlier. The room was full, faces expectant, concerned. She stepped to the front, aware of the eyes on her. The guards stood at the edges, unobtrusive. "I know some of you are scared," Margaret said. "I am too. Fear isn't failure. It's information." She talked about vigilance, about speaking up, about watching for changes that felt wrong. She did not mention threats. She did not mention protection. She focused on agency. When she finished, the room rose to its feet. Not applause, something steadier. Afterward, an older woman approached her. "My husband would have loved you," she said. Margaret smiled. "I hope he would have listened." That night, Margaret returned home, the sedan following at a respectful distance. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, breathing. She walked through the house, touching the walls again, grounding herself. In the study she sat at the desk and opened the notebook where names filled page after page. She added another. Threats were not the end. They were proof. Proof that what she had done mattered. Margaret closed the notebook and turned off the light. Some people thought justice was loud. They were wrong. Sometimes it arrived quietly in the form of a woman who refused to be afraid enough to stop, and she was still standing. The first crack in the network came from a place no one had been watching. A small credit union in western Nebraska flagged a transaction that did not fit. Not because of the amount, but because of the hesitation. The teller noticed the man's hand hover over the counter, the way his eyes flicked toward the door twice before he slid the envelope forward. It was the kind of detail that never made reports, until someone trained her to notice. By the time the alert reached Ruth Calder's desk, the name attached to it matched the one Margaret had written in her notebook weeks earlier. The Courier. Margaret was in a hotel room in Washington when the call came. She had just finished a long meeting that left her throat dry and her shoulders tight. She listened without interrupting, pacing slowly from the window to the desk and back. "He's moving cash and documents," Ruth said. "We think he's nervous. He made contact with 2 former Whitman associates in the last 48 hours. Margaret stopped pacing. "Where?" "Kansas City. St. Louis. He's trying to stitch together something that still works." Margaret looked out at the city below. Lights stretched in every direction, confident, indifferent. "He won't succeed," she said. "Not if he's rushing." Ruth exhaled. "We're setting a trap." Margaret's voice was calm. "Then I want to be looped in." There was a pause. "That's not protocol." Margaret did not soften her tone. "Then adjust it." Ruth smiled on the other end of the line. "I'll call you back." The next morning, Margaret sat in a secure briefing room with people who no longer questioned why she was there. Maps were spread across the table, names circled, arrows drawn and redrawn. The courier's name was Daniel Hargreave, mid-40s, no priors, the kind of man who believed loyalty could substitute for intelligence. "He knows something," an analyst said. "Enough to matter." Margaret leaned forward. "Then he also knows fear." The analyst nodded. "He's been making mistakes." Margaret tapped the table once. "People who make mistakes want reassurance." Ruth looked at her. "You're suggesting contact." Margaret met her gaze. "I'm suggesting leverage." By afternoon, the plan was set. Controlled. Legal. Precise. Margaret would not meet Hargreave. She would let him see her. That evening, Margaret attended a public forum on elder financial safety at a university auditorium outside Baltimore. The event had been scheduled months earlier. Tickets were free. Attendance was high. Margaret took the stage under bright lights, her presence steady, her words sharp and measured. She spoke about systems, about patterns, about how exploitation depended on anonymity. Somewhere in the back, a man with a baseball cap pulled low shifted in his seat. Hargreave watched her carefully. Not with anger. with calculation. He recognized authority when he saw it. That was why he was here. That was why he was scared. Margaret did not look toward him. She did not need to. She spoke instead of exposure, of how names moved from shadows to records, of how networks collapsed, not from force, but from visibility. When the event ended, Margaret stepped off stage and walked toward the side exit. The hallway was narrow, quiet. Hargreave followed. "Mrs. Lawson," he said softly. Margaret stopped. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Yes." He swallowed. "I just wanted to say what you're doing is important." Margaret studied him. His eyes were tired, his hands empty. He did not look like a mastermind. He looked like a man who had borrowed courage from worse people. "Important enough for you to find me," Margaret said. Hargreave's jaw tightened. "I don't want trouble." "Then stop carrying it for others," Margaret replied. They stood there, the hum of distant conversation filling the space. "I don't know what you think I know," Hargreave said. Margaret leaned slightly closer. "You know where the money went when it stopped moving." Hargreave flinched. "Just barely." Margaret straightened. "You have a choice. Cooperate now, or be remembered as the man who waited too long." She turned and walked away. Hargreave stood frozen, the words settling in. 2 hours later, Ruth's phone rang. "He's talking," she said. "He wants a deal." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Good. The unraveling accelerated after that. Names flowed, accounts surfaced, patterns locked into place. What had once looked like isolated schemes became a web with a center that extended beyond Whitman. By the end of the week, indictments were drafted, warrants issued, press briefings prepared coolly deliberately. Margaret watched the news from her living room, the sound low. Elaine sat beside her feet, tucked under herself. "You look tired," Elaine said. Margaret nodded. "I am. You regret any of it?" Margaret considered the question. "No. But I respect the cost now." The phone rang again. "Mrs. Lawson," a man said. "This is Assistant Attorney General James Harlow." Margaret straightened. "Yes. We're preparing a federal case that will set precedent. We want you as a named advisor. Publicly." Margaret exhaled slowly. "That will make me a target." Harlow's tone was firm. "You already are." Margaret nodded. "Then let's do it right." That night, Margaret stood alone in her study, reviewing documents she had once hoped to keep private forever. She had crossed a line. There was no returning to anonymity. She thought of the threats, the fear, the lives already altered. She signed. The next morning, the announcement broke. A coordinated takedown, multiple states, federal oversight, restitution funds mandated, training requirements enforced, and at the center of it, a woman who had once been called only because she looked familiar. Robert watched the broadcast from his cell, hands clasped tightly, eyes hollow. He understood now what he had set in motion. Too late. Linda Parker watched from a small apartment, the sound muted tears, streaming silently. She recognized the woman on the screen, not as an enemy, as a mirror. Hargreave sat across from federal agents, answering questions carefully, his future narrowing with each word. He knew one thing for certain. Silence had been a lie he could no longer afford. That evening, Margaret attended a small gathering at the community centre. No cameras, no speeches, just people. An older man approached her, hat in hand. "My sister got her money back," he said. Margaret smiled softly. "I'm glad." He hesitated. "You saved her." Margaret shook her head. She saved herself. She just needed someone to listen. Later alone again, Margaret opened her notebook. Many names were crossed out now, some circled, a few left blank. She closed it gently. The system was breaking open. Light was moving in. But she knew better than to believe it was finished. Predators adapted. So would she. And the final reckoning was still ahead. The final hearing was quieter than anyone expected. No cameras crowded the aisle. No reporters whispered into phones. Just a long wooden table, a federal seal on the wall, and a room full of people who finally understood the cost of ignoring what felt inconvenient. Margaret Lawson sat near the front, hands folded, posture composed. She had learned that stillness could be louder than outrage. Across the room, the last of the defendants listened as terms were read. Restitution funds, asset seizures, permanent bans from financial practice. Words that carried weight because they would outlive the room. When it was over, there was no applause. Only the scrape of chairs and the soft murmur of people standing up, gathering coats, returning to lives that would look different now. Outside, winter sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. Margaret paused there, breathing it in. Not relief. Resolution. Ruth joined, her coat collar turned up against the cold. "It's done," she said. Margaret nodded. "This part is?" Ruth hesitated. "You changed things." Margaret looked out at the streetcars passing people, unaware of how close so many lives had come to unraveling quietly. "Things were already changing," she said. "I just stopped pretending they weren't." That afternoon, Margaret returned home for the first time in weeks without an agenda waiting. No briefing, no meeting, no flight to catch. The house greeted her with familiar sounds, the tick of the clock, the soft creak of the stairs. She set her bag down and stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle without feeling empty. She walked into the study and opened the window slightly. Cold air slipped in clean and sharp. On the desk sat the notebook that had started it all. Pages filled, crossed out, annotated. She ran her hand over the cover, then closed it and placed it in the drawer. Some things did not need to be revisited to be honored. Elaine arrived just before dinner, carrying a grocery bag and a tired smile. "I thought you might want something normal," she said. Margaret laughed softly. Normal sounds perfect. They cooked together, moving around each other with the ease of sisters who had weathered enough storms to recognize calm when it came. They ate at the kitchen table, no television on, no phones buzzing. "Do you miss him?" Elaine asked gently. Margaret considered the question, not with pain, but with honesty. "I miss who I thought he was," she said. "I don't miss who he chose to become." Elaine nodded. "That makes sense." Later that evening, Margaret sat alone on the couch, a blanket over her legs. the house dim. She thought of the women she had met in community centers and court hallways, the men who had sat across from her, shame etched into their faces, the children who would never know how close their futures had come to being rewritten by someone else's greed. Her phone buzzed. Mrs. Lawson, a message read, "This is Teresa Green again. My mother got the letter today. The funds came back." She cried. "Thank you." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that single word. Not as gratitude, as confirmation. Another message followed, then another. Quiet ripples spreading outward. She set the phone down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For years, she had believed power was something loud, something taken. She knew better now. Real power was attention, presence, the refusal to look away. The next morning, Margaret stood in front of the mirror, fastening a simple necklace she had worn for decades. She looked older than she had a year ago, stronger too. Lines etched by experience, not regret. She stepped outside and walked the block, slowly, neighbors, waving a few, stopping to talk. Not about the case, about weather, about grandchildren, about ordinary things that mattered because they endured. At the end of the street, she paused and looked back at her house, not as a place that had almost been lost, but as a place that had held. That afternoon, Margaret recorded a short message in the quiet of her study. No script, no teleprompter. Just her voice, steady and clear. She spoke about trust, about paying attention to the moments that felt small but weren't, about checking in, asking questions, refusing to let embarrassment keep people silent. She did not name names. She did not dramatize. She told the truth and let it stand. When she finished, she sat there for a moment, hands resting on the desk, then turned the camera off. The story would travel now, without her controlling it. That was as it should be. That evening, Margaret returned to the community center one last time for a small gathering. No banners, no speeches, just coffee-folding chairs and familiar faces. An older woman took her hand. "You made it safer for us," she said. Margaret squeezed back. "You made it possible by speaking up." As the room emptied, Margaret turned off the lights and stood in the doorway, listening to the echo of footsteps fading down the hall. This place had witnessed fear, anger, resolve. It would witness more. That was the nature of communities that chose to pay attention. She locked the door and stepped into the cold night air, breath visible steady. Some stories end with a verdict. This one ended with awareness. If this story moved you, let it keep moving. Like the video, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with these 3 words: protect our elders.